So allow me to introduce myself again. I'm Laura Morton, and I'm not here today as a mental health expert. I'm here today as a parent who's raising an anxious daughter. I don't profess to know what so many of you do when it comes to educating our children, but what I do know is it isn't easy. In fact, aside from being a parent, I don't think there's a more important job or responsibility than that of our educators. So I'd like to start off today, if you'll allow me, to say thank you to each and every one of you for the work that you're doing. I know these have been difficult times, especially with the past few years and the soaring rates of mental health disorders, but this has made your job even harder. Each of you has a powerful impact on our children's lives, and for that, I'm extremely grateful. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Now, in 2018, I was sitting at my desk one day. I was feeling completely defeated as a parent. My daughter, Sebi, who you saw in the trailer, she'd been struggling with anxiety since she was 3 years old. I felt like I was failing her in every way. It actually took 7 years for someone to tell me that my daughter had anxiety. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't understand the signs. I took her to therapists. I took her to specialists, I took her to her pediatrician, and they all pointed to her physical health and not her emotional well-being as the culprit. I was told that she needed more fiber in her diet, that her bathroom issues were completely normal, that she would outgrow it. I was told that her distress when I traveled for work was completely normal. Her need for certainty, normal. Her constant visits to the nurse's office at school, normal. You know, as a parent, I just wanted somebody to tell me what I was dealing with. I wanted a label. I wanted an answer so that we could find a solution. As a parent, I knew inherently that what was happening was anything but normal. My child was suffering, and she was hurting, and it seemed that no matter what I did, she wasn't getting any better. I thought what was happening in our home was only happening in our home because no one I knew was talking about this, at least not in the open. Now remember, this was 2018. While anxiety among our youth was already an epidemic, it would take a pandemic to bring this to the forefront. And if our family was suffering, I couldn't imagine how other families were getting through this. I couldn't imagine how difficult it was for them. So I did something that would forever change the way that I looked at this crisis. I posted on Facebook. One line, kids and anxiety, who's dealing with it? And the response that I got was pretty amazing. It was, I am, we are, my son is, my granddaughter is. And it was amazing to me because this was something we hadn't talked about, but it was really the private messages that started coming in, and they were coming from people that I knew, people that I socialized with, and we had never once had we talked about what was happening with our kids. Here's just one response that I received. Now, this email came from someone I've known since we were kids, honest, open, and very raw. We had never talked about what our families were going through. That is, until that day that I posted on Facebook, which somehow ripped the shroud of shame and stigma away and opened the door to have that conversation. As a storyteller by trade, I instantly recognized there was something important happening, that this was an opportunity to understand what was occurring within families everywhere. At the time, the question everybody seemed to be asking was, are we more anxious or are we just more aware of it? And in 2018, I think that was a fair question. But today, of course, I think it's safe to say that we are definitely more anxious. The statistics show it, and I think we're more aware of it. You know, one of the reasons that I think that we're seeing heightened rates of anxiety and mental health disorders is that we have a generation of parents who never dealt with their own anxiety. And in an effort to not have their kids feel the way that they do, they've tried to protect them. And in the process, the kids aren't learning resilience or how to recognize, let alone manage their emotions, their anxious emotions when they arise. The truth is, if you come from a family with a history of mental health disorders, you have a higher chance of having them too. It can be multi-generational, especially if we never learn to manage it ourselves. So when I set out to make this film, I wanted to understand why we've become this anxious nation. What was causing this meteoric rise in anxiety? especially among our youth. And most of all, I wanted to understand what can we do. Oh, is there no? Sorry. I don't know what that blank screen was, but here we go. Most of all, I wanted to understand what we could do about it. And I wanted to look at anxiety from all sides, including its impact on different socioeconomic backgrounds, cultural beliefs, location, and finally, in the multitude of ways that anxiety shows up. What I quickly realized was that parents find it incredibly daunting to think about, let alone talk about, anxiety. They're confused, they don't understand the dynamics, and they can't easily recognize the symptoms. They're frustrated and angry, perhaps incapable, and then they misplace their own energy, which causes an even greater division amongst the family unit. And in the process, parents are leaning on schools to help because they're so overwhelmed and they simply don't know what to do. And at the same time, schools are overwhelmed by the demand of students and they weren't prepared for the onslaught. They're understaffed, underfunded, and undereducated on how to manage this crisis. Before COVID, the average wait time on a college campus to get an intake appointment was 3 to 12 weeks. That number has grown significantly. And then, once a student is seen, they usually limit their sessions with a therapist to 5 sessions. We wouldn't limit chemotherapy or any other medical treatment to 5 sessions. We would treat the ailment until it's cured. So this is telling us that we must treat mental health in the same way that we do physical health, but I'm going to talk a little bit more on that later. Now, in some ways, my decision to make this film was completely selfish. I mean, how lucky was I that I got to go around and interview some of the greatest experts on this subject, especially as a parent who was struggling myself. Every time I finished an interview, I left with incredible nuggets of knowledge. But in many ways, I left feeling really bad about myself as a parent, too, because it seemed I was doing it all wrong. As it turns out, the things that I thought I was doing, the actions that were coming from a totally loving and caring place, were actually adding to my daughter's anxiety. And my intention was to alleviate it. And my goal should have been teaching her how to manage it. However, my quest to make this film was also selfless. I understood that if I could walk away from these interviews with all of these insights and information, I thought so many others could too. And so I set off on this journey to explore anxiety, and the culmination of that is our award-winning documentary, Anxious Nation. Now, today I'm going to lay out 5 easy, cost-effective ways we can connect mental health and education. The first step we heard a little bit about earlier today, and that's that we have to create a common language. When we talk about mental health and anxiety, we tend to use these terms pretty loosely. I'd argue that we don't even really have a clear language when it comes to talking about it. If someone's having a bad day, well, that's their mental health. If someone has schizophrenia or bipolar disease, that's mental health too. And if you go to a spa and get a massage and take care of yourself, well, in many ways, that's mental health too. Now, when I say physical health to you, I think you immediately understand and know what I'm talking about. You know, it's about exercise and eating healthy and knowing your family history and taking care of your body. So the first thing I think we need to do is create a language for mental health that's perceived in a similar way to physical health so we can all be on the same page. One way that I think we can be effective is to define what we mean when we say the words mental health. Here's one of the best definitions that I've heard when it comes to defining mental health. A state of well-being where you use different skills to address challenges in your life in order to thrive. It's also important to understand that when we talk about anxiety, that we see it as a syndrome fueled by a collection of symptoms and not a disease. It's treatable, but not curable. And that's okay, because in the right circumstances, you want to have that response, right? It's that feeling that we all get when we feel like something bad is going to happen. Anxiety is a natural part of life. It's our primitive fight or flight instinct that we're all born with, which means we're genetically wired to feel anxious in the right situations. It's literally in our DNA. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, though, between natural amounts of anxiety and the crippling kind, the kind that make day-to-day life challenging, especially if you suffer from an anxiety disorder. For those people, everyday situations become threatening and scary, impossible to navigate. For our children, this might show up in terms of not wanting to take a test, worrying about measuring up to others' expectations, fear of failure, and worrying about letting other people down. For some, anxiety is totally manageable, but for others, it's completely downright debilitating. You know, I think that there's no real way of defining anxiety, just as there's no real way of defining love. It shows up in so many different ways. I call it a shapeshifter in our house. It's not a one-size-fits-all problem, and therefore it can't be a one-size-fits-all solution. But when effectively managed, though, anxiety is like a backlog of energy that pulls us and compels us to push forward and get things done. And that's really what Anxious Nation is all about. It's about learning to harness anxious energy and use it for good. Now, little did I know that when I set out to make this film in 2019, that come 2020, we would be collectively experience the worst isolation and loneliness that we'd ever encountered. This was especially true for our kids. 2 weeks before lockdown, I had sent 14 cameras out into the field. I thought our kids in the film would be able to film themselves. I mean, they're doing such a good job with it for their social media. I thought this will be a breeze for them. Little did I know how good they would be at capturing their emotions in the moment as we all struggled through COVID-19. And when you watch the film, you'll see a lot of that footage is so raw and so real because they captured it. It's self-shot. We had kids in our film that were supposed to graduate high school and college, and we had kids in our film who had amazing internships set up at NBC and the NIH. Kids who were supposed to go to prom and get their driver's license, and so many other seminal life moments that got delayed at best. My daughter was set to start middle school. Instead, she was taking virtual classes from our living room, alone in a new city where we had just moved. No friends, no connections. By the time she started high school, she had missed out on so many formative experiences, making that transition even harder than usual. Now, I don't think we can fully yet understand the long-term impact the pandemic will have on our kids, but I think it has and will continue to manifest as time goes on. If you want to know the state of mental health in our schools today, here is what the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, recently said. Imagine a high school with 1,000 students. Now imagine 450 of them saying they're persistently sad or hopeless. 200 have considered suicide, and nearly 100 have tried to end their life in the past year.
It is not a surprise at all to me how frequently we are seeing kids with long histories of anxiety, and by the time that they hit college, the ability for these kids to move on with their lives really becomes impaired. And it was a long time in the making, unfortunately.
Today, I worry about a lot of things, honestly. It all falls into worrying about the future and the uncertainty of it all. Currently, I'm worried about college.
When I got to college, I basically was just shell-shocked. All the things that I didn't expect to be hard were just the constant grind and basically just all the same thoughts from my anxiety all came back into my life. When I tried to go see a counselor on campus, it was 3 weeks before I could even get an intake to discuss what was going on. And I remember thinking at that time, man, I've dealt with this for so long that I know how to deal with it, but imagine if this was a kid that didn't know what they were doing with anxiety or depression or anything, and they had to wait 3 weeks going through whatever they were going through to get an intake, not even the help that they needed.
My first panic attack was when I was 18, my freshman year of college. It was during a calculus exam. I suddenly couldn't breathe, and my hands were shaking. I couldn't even write on the test. Like, I literally had to just walk out and leave because I thought, like, something was happening to me. Like, I thought I was dying. I called my mom, and I was like, Mom, I was hyperventilating. I was like, I can't breathe. I don't know what's going on. And she was like, I think you're having a panic attack.
I didn't have a therapist yet. I waited like a month to get in.
And then I only got 5 sessions and they kicked me out. So I finally got close with the therapist there and they're like, oh, sorry, you like ran out of appointments. So then I had to find somebody else who ended up not taking my insurance, found somebody else who ended up just being really terrible. And so I just kept going through all these different therapists after I had found the one that was helping me, and then she could no longer see me. It doesn't make any sense at all how they work.
College campuses have to recognize that their consumer, their client, is more likely to have mental health disorders. It's not because of college. It's because that's the time the brain has those changes if you're genetically predisposed to getting those disorders. You talk to any president of college and he's going to say, or she's going to say, this is a problem. Where am I supposed to find the funds? Well, you're going to have to reallocate. You just have to, because this problem is not going away.
Our kids are struggling. Just last month, a research study by Wiley showed that post-pandemic, more than 80% of college students are struggling emotionally, with 60% of those kids identifying with anxiety and burnout, and 43% of them are saying that they're depressed. Students are seeing these difficulties among their friend groups too, especially in social settings, and they're experiencing less motivation and engagement at school. The study identified the return to in-person classes, the isolation felt during lockdown, and a lack of community and social engagements as the main reason they're feeling this way. As a result, absenteeism is at an all-time high, and not just for our students, but for their parents and the workforce too. The study also showed that students' educational preferences have changed since the pandemic, with 50% preferring hybrid or fully online classes. Yet, we know that those who take online classes are more likely to struggle with depression. And one other finding worth mentioning is that at least 50% of the faculty said supporting students' mental health needs has taken a toll on their own mental and emotional health, with 81% saying that their institution should be investing more resources to support faculty and staff mental health and well-being too. As the conversation around mental health has evolved, schools have become the most accessed mental health delivery system for our kids. And yet, just 1/3 of students who receive mental health services find that at school. This is not enough. I think we have to do better. When asked, students say that their schools often provide performative, inconsistent, and reactive mental health interventions, but fail to sustain a mental health-friendly culture year-round, one that consistently supports students. Too often, the students think that too often the emphasis is put on academic achievement first, when in fact, they want more mental health services and resources than they do good grades. And finally, a recent NAMI study says that students are frustrated that school initiatives don't address the stress that actually comes with school. They feel their schools encourage and pressure the need to achieve constant success with a singular goal of getting into college, pushing college and careers over students' hearts and souls. And to lighten things up a little bit with Elmo, this tweet, it was so simple and so effective. How many here saw this when it came out? Was anybody surprised by the reaction that this tweet had? Well, I mean, as it turned out, it created an unexpected global therapy session. I mean, merely checking in and saying, how is everyone doing? It created a tsunami of responses. And for the most part, people said, not good, Elmo, not good. You know, all it takes is one question, whether it was my post on Facebook or Elmo's tweet. Just one question can connect us in community. I was living in New York City when 9/11 happened. And you know, New Yorkers, we can be a harried and hurried bunch, although I don't live in New York anymore. But when the World Trade Centers came down, we were never the same. I don't think any of us were the same, but New Yorkers were especially impacted. The simple question of, how are you, took on a whole new meaning. And I might add that taking a beat to listen, to really hear how people were doing, it became a habit. For a while anyway, until people do what they do and they get back to their life as normal, albeit a new normal. So that's why I think the second thing that we can do to connect education and mental health is to check in with each other. In many ways, I think that checking in with others is something we need to instill in our everyday lives. Whether you're an educator, a parent, a student, a friend, the gesture of asking, "How are you?" and really wanting to know opens the door to having important conversations. And yes, these conversations can be difficult at times, but isn't that the most vital reason to have that conversation? I think we have to agree that we have to have these difficult conversations, even if we know they're going to be hard. By implementing time and creating safe spaces in class for regular check-ins with students, a healthier classroom environment can be created, one where teachers are more aware of their students' circumstances and students are able to harness those connections and break down the stigma around feeling not okay at times. There's no doubt that we must treat our mental health in the same way that we treat our physical health. And we have to learn to care for the mind in the same way that we care for the body. We can achieve this by teaching mental health literacy, and I heard them talking a little bit about this on the panel earlier. We have to see the body as a whole and not above the neck and below the neck as separate entities. You know, when it comes to mental health, on average, it takes families 2 to 8 years to seek help. Mostly because they don't know that there's a problem. And even then, it could take years to get a proper diagnosis, let alone treatment. Remember, it took 7 years for someone to tell me my daughter had anxiety. This is interesting because we don't really do this with physical health. We're proactive and we're preventative, and we promote a message that everyone should have it. You know, if you have a rash, you immediately put some cortisone on it. And if that rash doesn't clear up in a couple of days, you're in the doctor's office. And if it doesn't clear up, you go to the dermatologist's office, certainly within a week or two. And I find this really interesting because we're so willing to treat a rash with more seriousness than we do our mental health. When we give basic mental health training to students, fewer will fall through the cracks, especially when there's a peer-to-peer network of mental health care. Without this education, how are we or the students are supposed to identify, let alone understand it? And without proper training, how can we expect our educators to know the differences? It isn't enough to teach our students, just teach our students. We all need to be educated if we're going to make a difference in their lives. Here's what I mean. A few years ago, as I mentioned earlier, my daughter was constantly going to the nurse's office at school. Whenever her anxiety reared its head, that was her haven. I remember being called by the nurse one day to come and get her. And when I walked into her office, I overheard the nurse saying to my daughter, "I want you to think of my office as your safe place here at school." Well, I took a deep breath, and then I asked my daughter to give us a moment to chat. And I explained that I understood that the nurse's intentions were pure and that she wanted my daughter to feel safe at school, and I thanked her for her compassion. But what she didn't know or understand was that my daughter's anxiety is triggered by not feeling safe anywhere at school. So when the nurse proclaimed that her office was the safe place at school, my daughter, who was very young at the time, processed that as every other place in school wasn't safe. And so she landed in the nurse's office daily. This is why we need to provide our educators with the proper language and tools and resources, and that includes the school nurses and the counselors. We know that teachers who are properly trained to look for warning signs feel more comfortable and confident in their ability to direct the student to professional resources if and when necessary. And one other thing that I think it's really important to make sure we're not doing, particularly with teenagers around their mental wellness, is to make sure we're not talking about it in a way that makes it permanent. When we use the language of permanence, this is who you are, this is what you're going to deal with for the rest of your life, we take away hope. And when you've got a teenager who's anxious and depressed and isolated in their own head, when you take away hope, that's when we put them at the greatest risk. So a few weeks ago, my daughter and I were in Santa Barbara for a screening of our film. It was hosted by a local school who invited other educators and heads of schools from all around the county to share this experience as a community. During the Q&A, someone asked my daughter what advice she would give to schools about mental health. In other words, what would she like to see implemented? Her answer was pretty simple, and I thought really spot on. She talked about this need for belonging and not feeling judged for her anxiety. She spoke about a wonderful program she just attended at her high school called Challenge Day. Has anybody heard of Challenge Day here? She loved this program. Challenge Day is a program where students and teachers get to create an emotional connection that leads to better communication, builds trust, and is a foundation that can be built on. The program teaches that vulnerability is the cornerstone of growth and resilience. It had been years since I picked my daughter up from school, and I saw her so fired up about her day. She was engaged, she was encouraged, and she was hopeful. Students thrive when schools promote deep social connections that create a sense of belonging. To accomplish this, people need to feel two things: seen and heard. Teachers play a special role here. Students who have a meaningful interaction with their teacher or their professor or even a coach are significantly less likely to feel lonely, isolated, and disconnected, especially at school. As educators, you can offer all the right resources to students, hoping you've put the proper tools in place to cope with their mental health, and yet so many of those kids go home to an environment that doesn't foster those beliefs. So I believe we have to bridge the gap between students and parents to systemically help create a better transition between school and home life. And we can do that by offering special events, bringing in authors, bringing in filmmakers, therapists, and even creating student panels to discuss the state of mental health and to offer important information from local resources. The best panels that we've been a part of are those that have included students' voices and stories. There's simply nothing more powerful than hearing about their experiences around mental health directly from them. And as Dr. Harvey so eloquently stated earlier today, you can't architect a lived experience. So to review, here are the 5 things that I think, as a non-professional, that we can do to integrate mental health and education. Create a common language, check in, teach mental health literacy, create a community, and have regular events for parents to attend so that they can learn more about student mental health and how to support their child. Now, before I go and end my presentation today, I want to share something personal with you. Up there on the screen is a photo of me with my 5th grade school teacher. That's Miss Cooper, AKA the Dragon Lady. This remarkable woman took me under her wing when my mom died in 1975. She checked in with me and always gave me a safe place to talk about my feelings. We've stayed in touch all of these years. It's been 50 years, by the way. We just had dinner together last week. And she's had the most profound impact on my life. I share this with you today because I want to reiterate the impact that you, as educators, can and often do have on your students, especially when they're struggling, hurting, and being challenged. Never underestimate the power of that connection. Thank you so much. It's been my absolute privilege to be here today. Thank you.